The conference room doors slammed open, just as Daniel Mercer reached for my uncle's will. "Thomas was my brother," my mother announced, marching inside with my father behind her. "Whatever happened between us, he wouldn't cut out his own sister." 17 years. That was how long it had been since Linda Carter had looked at me like I was her daughter instead of a problem she'd successfully gotten rid of. Her eyes swept across the table and stopped on me. "What is she doing here?" Nobody answered. Mom pointed directly at me. "Thomas took her in after we disowned her. That doesn't put her ahead of his actual sister." I was 14 when my parents packed my belongings into a suitcase and drove me to Uncle Thomas's house. Now I was 31, sitting beside the attorney responsible for distributing the multi-million-dollar estate my uncle had spent decades building. And somehow, Mom still spoke to me like I was that powerless teenager. I folded my hands on the table. "You should stop talking before Daniel starts reading." Her mouth tightened. "Still disrespectful," she said. 17 years and Thomas never fixed that." Dad touched her arm. "Linda." She shrugged him off. "No, Thomas believed families eventually forgive each other. He knew I'd come when the time was right." Something about Dad bothered me. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at a thick sealed folder beside Daniel's briefcase. "Mrs. Carter," Daniel said carefully, "neither you nor your husband was invited to this meeting. I don't need an invitation to hear my own brother's will." Mom pulled out a chair. No one welcomed her. Thomas's longtime friends and several relatives sat around the polished table, watching the woman who had barely spoken to him during his final years behave as though his fortune were already hers. Mom glanced around. "Well, read it." Daniel didn't move. She gave an impatient laugh. "Thomas had properties, investments, businesses. We all know we're talking about millions, so can we stop pretending this is complicated?" I looked at her. For 17 years, she had controlled the story. I had been the difficult daughter, the liar, the ungrateful child who supposedly chose a wealthy uncle over her own parents. Uncle Thomas had never forced me to fight that story. He had simply kept records. "Mom." Hearing me call her, that made her turn. "You came here expecting Uncle Thomas to make you rich," I said. "You should be asking why he made sure you were here to hear this." For the first time, her confidence flickered. Dad immediately looked at Daniel's sealed folder again. "What does that mean?" Mom demanded. Before I could answer, the door opened. Daniel's assistant hurried inside and whispered into his ear. I watched the color drain from Daniel's face. He stood so quickly his chair scraped across the floor. Then he looked straight at my parents. Not angry. Horrified. And suddenly, I understood that whatever Uncle Thomas had arranged before his death was about far more than who inherited his money. The only question was, what had he left behind that could frighten his own lawyer more than my mother crashing the will reading? 17 years earlier, I was standing in my parents' kitchen with a bank statement trembling between my fingers. I was 14, and I had no idea that one question was about to cost me my home. "Mom," I said, "where did Uncle Thomas's money go?" She stopped halfway across the kitchen. "What money?" "The money for school." Her expression changed instantly. A week earlier, Uncle Thomas had asked how my tutoring was going. When I told him Mom said we couldn't afford it anymore, he looked confused. "I've been sending money for your education, Nina." I thought he meant a few $100s. Then I accidentally found the statement among papers Mom had left on the dining table. There were transfers with Uncle Thomas's name attached. Thousands of dollars. Yet whenever I needed money for school activities, books, tutoring, or academic programs, Mom gave me the same answer. "We can't afford everything you want." So I asked the question. That was all. Mom snatched the statement from my hand. "You've been going through my private documents." I wasn't going through anything. It was on the table. "You're calling me a thief." I didn't say that. Dad walked in from the hallway. What's going on? Mom held up the statement. Your daughter thinks we're stealing from her. Dad's eyes hardened. Apologize to your mother. But I didn't accuse her of anything. Nina, I just want to know where Uncle Thomas's money is. The silence afterward frightened me more than yelling would have. Dad looked at Mom. Mom looked at me. Then she said quietly, if you think we're such terrible parents, maybe you shouldn't live here. I stared at her. What? You heard me. I thought it was another threat. Parents said things when they were angry. They cooled down. They talked later. Except Dad walked upstairs. 10 minutes later, he came back carrying my suitcase. My stomach dropped. Dad, get your coat. I looked at Mom, waiting for her to stop him. She didn't. Where am I going? Mom folded her arms. You seem to trust Thomas more than us. He can deal with you. Less than an hour later, I was sitting in the back seat while Dad drove across town. Nobody spoke. My suitcase was in the trunk. The bank statement was clenched in my hand. When Uncle Thomas opened his front door, his face changed the moment he saw me. Nina. Dad pulled my suitcase from the car. She's staying with you. Thomas looked from him to Mom. For how long? Mom answered without hesitation. Permanently. My throat tightened. Uncle Thomas stared at her. Linda, she's 14. And we're finished. Mom pointed toward me. She lies. She snoops. She creates problems, and I'm not raising an ungrateful child who thinks her own mother is stealing from her. Thomas finally noticed the paper in my hand. What is that, Nina? Mom stepped forward. Don't encourage her. Thomas didn't argue. He simply took my suitcase from Dad and put one hand gently on my shoulder. Come inside. I crossed the doorway. Then Thomas looked at me. You can stay here as long as you need. Mom followed him several steps away from me and lowered her voice, but the hallway was quiet enough that I could hear her. You don't know what she's like, Thomas. She lies. She's taken things before. She's been causing trouble for months. Thomas listened without interrupting. Then he asked one question. If that's true, Linda, why are you afraid of me looking at the account? Mom went completely still. Dad looked away. Thomas waited. Neither answered. Finally, Mom grabbed her purse. You'll learn. She walked outside. Dad followed. Thomas closed the door behind them. That night, he sat across from me at his dining room table. Tell me everything. So I did. Every time, Mom said there was no money. Every school program I couldn't attend. Every tutoring session that stopped. Every conversation I remembered about Uncle Thomas's transfers. Then I placed the statement in front of him. He read it twice. His jaw tightened, but he didn't accuse anyone. Instead, he made a copy. Do you have anything else? I don't know. Then we'll find out. The next morning, I woke to Uncle Thomas speaking on the phone in his study. Yes, he said, effective immediately. I stopped outside the doorway. No more transfers through Linda or Robert. A pause. Then Thomas said something that made me realize my question. In that kitchen had opened a door my parents desperately wanted closed. And find me an accountant. I want to know where every dollar went. 3 months after Uncle Thomas stopped sending money through my parents, I walked into a family gathering and discovered Mom had already put me on trial. My Aunt Patricia caught me near the dining room before I had even taken off my coat. Nina, your mother is devastated. I glanced across the room. Mom was surrounded by relatives. She didn't look devastated. She looked prepared. Aunt Patricia, I haven't done anything. You left your parents for a richer household. My stomach tightened. I didn't leave. They drove me to Uncle Thomas's house. Patricia lowered her voice. Then apologize and go home before this destroys the family. Before I could answer, Mom called from across the room. Don't pressure her, Patricia. Nina made her choice. Heads turned. Suddenly, everyone was listening. Mom gave me a wounded look. She decided she'd rather live with Thomas because he can give her things we can't. That isn't what happened. You accused me of stealing. I asked where the money went. Dad stood beside her. Same thing. No, it isn't. I stepped forward, but Uncle Thomas caught my arm. Don't. I looked at him. They're lying. I know. Then say something. Thomas released my arm and walked toward Mom. He didn't raise his voice. Linda, I'll ask you one question. Mom folded her arms. Go ahead. Thomas looked around the room before returning his attention to her. Why did money I transferred specifically for Nina's education repeatedly disappear from the account where it was supposed to remain? The conversations around us stopped. Mom blinked. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. Dad stepped forward. Thomas, if you're accusing us of something, say it. I'm asking about the transfers. Mom laughed sharply. You gave money to help your niece. We use money to raise your niece. Food costs money. Electricity costs money. Clothes cost money. Dad nodded. Exactly. Raising a child isn't free. Thomas remained calm. That would be relevant if these were general gifts to you. Mom's expression tightened. They weren't. No. That single word changed the room. Thomas continued. Every transfer came with written instructions. The funds were intended for Nina's education and future. Tuition, tutoring, academic expenses, savings for college. Several relatives exchanged looks. Mom's face reddened. You're discussing our private finances in front of everyone because a 14-year-old filled your head with nonsense. No, Thomas said. I'm discussing my money because I know what instructions accompanied it. You always wanted to control everything. Mom grabbed her purse. This is exactly why Nina went running to you. You give her whatever she wants and then make us look like monsters. She turned toward me. You'll understand when you're older. Dad followed her toward the door. Nobody stopped them. But not everyone suddenly believed me either. I could see it in their faces. Questions. Doubt. Confusion. Later, when the house had emptied, I found Uncle Thomas in his study placing documents into a thick folder. Why didn't you show them everything? I asked. He looked up. Because I don't have everything yet. But they still think I might be lying. Thomas closed the folder. Nina, accusations are easy to deny. Records aren't. He placed it inside a locked cabinet. When the accountant finishes, we'll preserve everything. When you're older, you can decide whether you ever want to do anything with it. From then on, Thomas changed everything. My school expenses were paid directly. My tutoring resumed. Money intended for my future never passed through my parents again. And Thomas never forced me to contact them. Years passed. The folder stayed locked away. Until one evening, I saw Thomas adding another document to it. I asked why he was still keeping records after so much time. He shut the cabinet and looked at me. One day your mother may come back for my money, and that will be the day she learns why I kept every page. Mr. Mercer. Daniel's assistant was still standing beside him when he looked toward my mother. Then she handed him a document. Daniel read the first page, and the horror on his face slowly changed into recognition. Where did you get this? Mom stood. I brought it. Dad whispered, Linda, don't. She ignored him. I knew Thomas wouldn't leave me with nothing. Mom reached into her handbag and pulled out another copy. She placed it on the conference table like she'd just produced the winning card. Thomas promised me part of his estate. Daniel adjusted his glasses. This is an old draft. It names me. It does. Mom looked directly at me. Then perhaps Nina shouldn't be sitting there looking so pleased. I hadn't smiled once. She continued. Thomas wasn't well toward the end. Nina had 17 years to influence him against us. I want this reading stopped until we determine what she convinced him to sign. That finally explained Daniel's reaction. Mom hadn't merely crashed the reading. She had arrived prepared to challenge Uncle Thomas's final wishes. I looked at the pages again. I recognized them. Years earlier, Thomas had shown me the estate documents that replaced that draft. Daniel, I said, check the date. I already did. He turned the document toward Mom. This predates Mr. Carter's currently executed estate plan. It's unsigned, and it has no controlling effect. Mom's confidence faltered. Thomas still intended to provide for me. Intent expressed in an old draft does not override a later valid will. Mom stared at him. Then her anger swung toward me. She did this. Dad leaned closer. Linda, enough. No. Mom pointed at me. This started when she was 14. She lied about us then, and she's still benefiting from those lies now. Thomas turned against his own sister because Nina invented that story about money. The room became silent. I saw Daniel's expression change. Not shock this time. Attention. He picked up a pen. Mrs. Carter, are you formally alleging that Nina fabricated the financial concerns Thomas investigated 17 years ago? Yes. Dad grabbed her wrist. Don't do this. She pulled free. Why? Because everyone deserves to know what she did. Daniel's voice remained measured. You understand that you're asking me to note that allegation as part of your objection to the estate. Yes, write it down. Linda, Dad said again. This time, there was fear in his voice. Mom finally noticed. What is wrong with you? Dad didn't answer. But I knew. My eyes moved to the thick sealed folder beside Daniel. The same kind of folder Uncle Thomas had kept locked inside his study. For the first time since my parents entered the room, I understood why Dad hadn't been arguing about inheritance. He remembered the records. Daniel opened another section of Thomas's final instructions. There is a provision relevant to what you've just alleged. Mom's face tightened. What provision? Daniel read silently for several seconds. Then he looked at her. Mr. Carter instructed this office to address certain preserved documentation if either you or Robert challenged Nina's position in the estate or repeated claims that she fabricated the original financial issue. Mom stared at him. I withdraw it. Daniel paused. My objection, forget it. You've already made the allegation. I said forget it. Dad pushed his chair backward. Daniel reached for the sealed folder. My chest tightened when I saw Uncle Thomas's handwriting across the front. For Nina, if they ever blame her again. 17 years, disappeared for a moment. I was 14 again, sitting at Thomas's dining table, while he promised that records were harder to deny than accusations. Daniel placed his hand on the seal. Before he could break it, Dad shot to his feet. His chair crashed backward. Linda, we're leaving, now. No. My father stopped. For 17 years, I had imagined what I might say if I ever had the chance to confront the two people who packed my suitcase when I was 14. But standing inside that conference room, I didn't need to shout. Sit down, Dad. His face tightened. We don't have to stay for this. You came here for Uncle Thomas's money. Mom challenged his will and accused me of lying again. You don't get to walk out the second the evidence appears. Mom looked at Daniel. Just read the will. Daniel nodded. That is precisely what I'm going to do. Dad slowly returned to his chair. Daniel opened Uncle Thomas's final estate documents. He began with several smaller gifts to relatives and charitable organizations Thomas had supported for years. Then he reached the largest portion. The residue of the estate, including the principal investment holdings and real property interests designated herein, passes to Nina Carter. Mom stared at him. What? Daniel continued reading. I already knew Uncle Thomas had made me his principal heir. He had shown me the finalized estate plan before his death because he refused to let money become another secret in my life. But Mom hadn't known. How much? She demanded. Linda, Dad muttered. How much? Daniel closed that section of the document. The estate is valued in the multimillion-dollar range, subject to final administration. Mom's face went pale. And me. Daniel looked directly at her. You and Robert are not beneficiaries. She pushed back from the table. That is impossible. It is quite explicit. I am his sister. And this is his executed estate plan. Mom turned toward me. You did this. I didn't answer. Daniel reached for the sealed folder. No, Mrs. Carter. According to Thomas's records, what happened 17 years ago played a substantial role in his decision. He broke the seal. Dad lowered his head. Inside were bank records, transfer instructions, correspondence, and accounting reports. Daniel removed the first bundle. Over several years before Nina came to live with Thomas transferred approximately $186,000 under written instructions that the funds be preserved or used specifically for Nina's education and future. Mom immediately interrupted. We raised her. Do you think food was free? Clothes, electricity? Daniel didn't argue. He simply opened the accountant's report. The issue is not whether raising a child costs money. I finally spoke. That was never the issue. Mom looked at me. I held her gaze. You told me there was no money for tutoring, no money for school programs, no money for the things Uncle Thomas was specifically sending money to cover. We were your parents. We made financial decisions. And when I asked one question about those decisions, you threw me out. You accused me of stealing. I was 14. My voice stayed steady. I asked where the money went. Mom opened her mouth, but Daniel continued. Thomas's accountant traced substantial portions of the transferred funds into accounts and expenditures controlled by Linda and Robert, rather than Nina's designated educational needs. Nobody around the table moved. There it was. Not my memory. Not Mom's version. Records. The exact thing Uncle Thomas had spent 17 years protecting. Daniel placed several pages on the table. That is why Thomas stopped transferring money through you immediately after Nina moved into his home. Dad stared at his hands. Mom looked around the room as though someone might defend her. No one did. Aunt Patricia was there, the same woman who once told 14-year-old me to apologize before I destroyed the family. Now she couldn't look at my mother. Mom's voice dropped. So Thomas punished me forever because of money. No, I said. He protected me because you punished me for discovering it. Dad finally looked at me. Nina. I raised my hand. Don't. He stopped. Mom changed tactics. Thomas believed in family. Whatever mistakes were made, he wouldn't want you carrying this hatred forever. I almost laughed. Even now, she was trying to tell me what Uncle Thomas would have wanted. He taught me something about forgiveness, too. Mom waited. Forgiving someone doesn't mean giving them access to you again. Her lips parted. I turned back to Daniel. What happens with the records? The estate and these historical financial matters are separate, he explained. Thomas instructed his legal team to preserve the accounting evidence and make it available to you and your counsel. Any remedies that may still be available can be evaluated independently. I nodded. Then that's how we'll handle it. Mom frowned. What does that mean? It means I'm not fighting with you in this room. Attorneys can deal with the money. Her attempt to challenge, the will went nowhere. Daniel explained that Thomas's current documents had been properly executed and independently witnessed. The unsigned draft Mom carried into the room couldn't replace them simply because she preferred what the older version said. She had arrived expecting an inheritance. She left with none. But the money wasn't what changed the room. It was the story. For 17 years, I had been the daughter who supposedly abandoned her parents for a wealthy uncle. Now the relatives who had whispered about me had seen why Thomas took me in. Mom could still tell herself whatever she wanted. She just couldn't make everyone else believe it anymore. Dad stood first. This time, I didn't stop him. Mom remained, seated for another few seconds. She looked at me as though she were searching for the 14-year-old girl she could frighten into apologizing. That girl wasn't there. Then she picked up her handbag and followed Dad out. I never restarted a relationship with them, simply because Uncle Thomas was gone. If that door ever opened again, it would require accountability, not guilt, inheritance, or the word family used as leverage. I kept Uncle Thomas's house. And later, I used part of what he left me to establish an education fund in his name for teenagers who suddenly found themselves without stable homes. There was one thing from that conference room I valued more than any property. Inside Thomas's folder was a handwritten note. I framed it and placed it in my study. It read, "Being sent away was never proof that you were unwanted." For 17 years, I had wondered how my own parents could close their door on a 14-year-old girl and convince her she deserved it. Uncle Thomas never erased what happened. He did something better. He made sure the truth survived him. And 17 years after my parents closed their door on me, I walked out of Uncle Thomas's will reading knowing they would never again get to decide where I belonged.